Happy Friday, everybody, and for those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, happy spring. Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Now, today's episode is going to be very international focused, dealing with China's various relations with different regions and countries around the world. Let's jump in. First up, in a particularly concerning development, a major environmental disaster has struck Zambia following the collapse of a tailings dam at the copper mine majority owned by China Non-Ferrous Metals Industry Group. The breach, which occurred in late February at the Sino Metals Zambia mine, resulted in the release of approximately 50 million litres of toxic waste into a tributary of the Kafue River, the country's most vital waterway. The spill has caused severe contamination, with acidic waste, heavy metals, and dissolved solids floating downstream. According to the Engineering Institute of Zambia, pollution has been detected over 100 kilometres, 60 miles, from the site, raising fears of long-term ecological and health consequences. An Associated Press reporter visiting affected areas observed dead fish washing up along the riverbanks, a clear indication of the disaster's immediate impact on aquatic life. Given that nearly 60% of Zambia's 20 million people depend on the Kafue River for drinking water, agriculture, and industry, concerns are mounting over the broader ramifications for public health and economic stability. The Zambian president has called the situation a crisis, emphasizing that it threatens both livelihoods and biodiversity. Government officials and environmental groups are demanding accountability from the mine's operators, with calls for urgent remediation efforts and stricter oversight of mining practices in the country. As authorities assess the full scale of the damage, the disaster highlights the risks associated with mining operations and raises pressing questions about the environmental responsibility of foreign-owned, in this case Chinese, extractive industries in Africa. Next up, the US government has imposed sanctions on 2 Chinese petrochemical companies for allegedly purchasing and storing Iranian crude oil, marking the latest move in President Donald Trump's renewed, quote, maximum pressure, end quote, campaign against Iran. The State Department sanctioned Huaying Huizhou Daya Bay Petrochemical Terminal Storage for allegedly buying and holding Iranian oil on a vessel already subject to American restrictions. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department targeted Luqing Petrochemical, a private Chinese refinery known as a teapot refiner, for acquiring Iranian crude transported via vessels linked to Iran's military and Houthi rebels. The US Treasury Secretary expressed, quote, teapot refinery purchases of Iranian oil provide the primary economic lifeline for the Iranian regime, the world's leading state sponsor of terror. End quote. He emphasized that these sanctions aim to cut off Tehran's revenue streams, which the US claims fund terrorist activities and nuclear development. The US has vowed to intensify efforts to eliminate Iranian oil exports, including shipments to China, which remains Iran's primary customer. The latest sanctions also extend to 19 entities, including Chinese and Hong Kong-based firms operating ships in Iran's so-called shadow fleet. The move highlights growing US concerns over China-Iran cooperation, which spans oil trade and arms-related exports. Next up, Canada has strongly condemned China's execution of 4 of its citizens on drug-related charges, with Foreign Minister Joly calling for clemency and criticizing Beijing's actions. The executions mark a rare instance of Western nationals facing capital punishment in China, further exacerbating diplomatic tensions between the two nations. Yesterday, Thursday, Joly revealed that both she and former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had personally appealed for leniency but were unsuccessful. Quote, I asked personally for leniency. They were all dual citizens. End quote. Being dual citizens suggests that they were likely ethnically Chinese who were born in the PRC and obtained Canadian citizenship as children or young adults, though these details are unclear. However, China does not recognize dual citizenship. If they kept their PRC citizenship, then they are fully Chinese citizens in Beijing's eyes. Beijing's embassy in Canada defended the executions, asserting that the cases were handled strictly in accordance with Chinese law. China is believed to execute more prisoners than any other country in the world, though official figures remain a state secret. The executions come amid broader tensions in the China-Canada relationship, which have been fraught since Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in 2018 at the request of the United States authorities. In response, China detained 2 Canadians widely seen as retaliation retaliation until all three were released in 2021. More recently, Beijing imposed tariffs on Canadian agricultural imports in response to Ottawa's duties on Chinese-made electric vehicles, steel and aluminium. Meanwhile, China's foreign ministry dismissed Canada's reaction as political interference. Spokesperson Mao Ning stated, quote, "Canada should respect the spirit of the rule of law and stop interfering in China's judiciary sovereignty," end quote. And state-run Global Times in an editorial accused Canada of, quote, "transoceanic defense of drug criminals," end quote, and claimed its human rights criticism was politically motivated. With relations already at a low point, the executions may further complicate efforts to restore diplomatic and trade ties between the two nations. As many of you know, this week I was very excited to launch my second ever channel market update. I know that I said I would start with 2 or 3 episodes a week, and now it's going to be 5 episodes this week. Unfortunately, once I start working, I'm too lazy to stop. For those of you who have checked out the channel, thank you so much for the support and the feedback. It has been amazing. The 5th episode, the Friday episode for Market Update, was just released about an hour ago. This is the biggest yet. I found this one particularly interesting. So after China Update is finished, if you are interested, I've put a link to this episode in the description below. It's in the description box on the first line. It should be just right there in the description. Give that a click and it will take you to today's new market update episode. Again, thank you everyone for the amazing support. If you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, don't forget to like as well. And next up, China's ambitious push to enhance regional connectivity through cross-border railway projects has gained momentum as trade with neighboring countries surges. Major rail infrastructure projects, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, are reshaping trade routes and providing China with new economic and geopolitical advantages. In late February of this year, Vietnam's National Assembly approved an $8.37 billion railway project linking northern Vietnam with China's Yunnan province. A feasibility study will commence this year, with completion slated for 2030. Meanwhile, Vietnam is also accelerating the construction of the Lao Cai-Hanoi Haiphong Railway, influenced by the success of the China-Laos Railway, which has dramatically reduced shipping times between Southeast Asia and Europe. Currently, Vietnam's railway infrastructure remains inefficient due to mismatched track gauges. In December of 2023, Vietnam and China agreed to study the feasibility of standard gauge railway construction to streamline trade. However, Vietnam remains cautious about over-reliance on Chinese investment, balancing infrastructure needs with financial independence. Meanwhile, China is also pressing ahead with the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway, a $178 million project set to begin construction in July. The railway will link China's politically sensitive Xinjiang province with Uzbekistan, reducing the rail distance to Europe by 900 kilometers and cutting transit times by over a week. Despite its economic potential, the project has faced years of delays due to funding disagreements and logistical challenges. With China providing 51% of the funding through a joint venture, this railway will serve as a key alternative to the traditional freight routes passing through Russia, which have faced disruptions due to geopolitical tensions, most notably, of course, the war in Ukraine. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin, in a report this week, writes that Chinese rail companies are evolving beyond traditional contractors into full-fledged investors, financing, designing, and operating international projects. As competition in the global infrastructure market intensifies, Chinese companies are seeking profitable ventures abroad, including urban transit projects. Recent deals include a $5.6 billion metro project in Dubai and a $2.8 billion intercity rail project in Brazil, signaling China's shift towards more commercially viable investments in global rail infrastructure. While geopolitical risks and funding challenges persist, China's growing involvement in cross-border rail projects reflects a long-term strategy of integrating regional economies and securing strategic trade corridors. And finally for today, the Trump administration's decision to slash funding for the Voice of America, VoA, Radio Free Asia, and other US-backed media has been met with enthusiastic approval from Chinese nationalists, who view the move as a weakening of American soft power. While the United States government has long justified these institutions as tools for promoting democracy and countering authoritarian influence, their abrupt dismantling, some argue, has given China a significant strategic advantage in the global information war. David Bandowski, director of the China Media Project, in an analysis of Chinese media reactions to the this news observed this week. Against this backdrop, the actions of the Trump administration are cause for enthusiastic celebration. In a matter of weeks, Trump seems to have slit the throat of American influence. End quote. Beijing has long viewed Voice of America and similar entities as part of an American strategy to undermine Beijing's control over its domestic and global narrative. A state-run Global Times editorial echoed the sentiment, arguing this week that outlets like Voice of America were relics of the Cold War and that their decline was inevitable, writing, quote, "The narrative hegemony maintained by Voice of America is a lie factory," end quote. The piece further suggested that, quote, "the US information monopoly is collapsing," end quote. Proponents of the US-backed media funding cuts argue that they were bloated, ideologically biased, and a waste of money, and that they needed to be trimmed back. Critics, however, warn that the move is a strategic misstep that benefits China, Russia, and other authoritarian regimes. A Washington Post editorial, for example, highlighted how China, Iran, and Russia have invested billions in their global media efforts, often targeting developing nations and authoritarian leading states. Quote, "Xinhua has dozens of reporters in Washington. Now Voice of America doesn't have any," end quote. A pushback to this would be that there are dozens of private media outlets across the West, the Anglophone world, that continue to do work reporting on China. Some commentators argue that at the very least it's been a missed opportunity. Veteran China analyst Bill Bishop, for example, expressed this week, quote, "As Beijing continues to intensify its efforts in the global information battle, the Trump administration has unilaterally disarmed with the closure of Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, and other outlets, and the cutoff of funding to many NGOs. If Trump had a coherent strategy towards China, he might have been able to use these as a bargaining chip, but instead his administration just gave a massive gift to Beijing for nothing in return." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a good Friday, have a restful weekend, and I will see you all tomorrow.